two programs, two events. And once a month, we do Black Pack interviews. And that's where we invite guests who are known for particular achievements and ask them to join us and to delve into their Black Pack and share items of learning and guidance from their personal experience. And we've had a few, and we've had some really interesting discussions, and we'll have another one next month. But this evening, today, what we are doing is having our Black Pack critical conversation. And in the conversation, we invite specialists to share with us and to take questions on a particular subject, a particular area. And our critical conversation topic of discussion today is criminal justice across the African diaspora. And we have four passionate, four inspiring, four very interesting speakers who will be speaking and then taking questions. We've got Julius Kamfu, and Julius is a barrister. He's a barrister called to the bar in the UK as well as in Cameroon, and he'll be speaking from the Cameroon perspective. We've got Dr. Charlene Sinclair, and Charlene is an organizer, thinker, and a writer, and she's hailing from the USA. We've got Dr. Tara Young, a criminologist, writer and author, applied social researcher. She's hailing from the UK. And we've got Dr. Corinne Bailey, and Corinne, sociologist and senior research fellow. He's hailing from Barbados, the University of the West Indies there. So some interesting speakers, and we should have a great time this evening. But it's really time now for me to hand over to our host. And the host for this, my co-host for this evening is Dr. William Acker. And William hosts our critical conversation. William is a senior lecturer in the Department of Geography at Birkbeck University of London. He's currently the chair of the Transatlantic Roundtable of Religion and Race. That's an international organization that brings together academics, community activists, and church leaders with the aim of tackling injustices faced by the people of African descent around the world. So, William, it's great for me to hand over to you so that you can then take over and lead us into this fantastic conversation. Welcome, William.
Thank you, Marge, and thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate you coming out wherever you are from across the African diaspora and taking the time to be with us for this very crucial conversation. I think when we set this out, when we set out Black Pack in general, it was in response to the brutal murder of George Floyd. So it's perhaps apt that we're meeting the day after the verdict, and possibly that will be part of our conversation this evening, but also looking at criminal justice in the round across the African diaspora. What do we mean by criminal justice? And what does it mean for people of African descent to be impacted by these systems across the globe? Do they serve us, or do they harshly penalize us, treat us unjustly? Are there alternative ways of thinking about how our communities might be served by those who are supposed to serve us in these systems of justice? So our first two presenters, as Marge outlined, our first speaker will be Julius Nkafu, who is a barrister called to the bars of England and Wales and Cameroon. He's an expert in international arbitration with over 22 years of legal experience in the City of London and Cameroon. Lectures on international arbitration at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and is a member of the panel of arbitrators with the London Court of International Arbitration, as well as a number of international arbitration centers. Following his presentation, Dr. Charlene Sinclair will speak to us. She's an organizer, thinker, and writer whose work centers on the intersection of race, gender, and economic justice. She founded the Center for Religion, Race, and Economic Democracy, and serves currently as a consultant, trainer, and advisor to leading social change organizations and individual prophetic leaders. So very excited to kick off these series with these two speakers. So now I'll hand over to Julius and Kathy to introduce his 10 minutes to this.
Right. In fact, William and Julius, sorry to just butt in just like that, but we are having apparently some feedback issues, and I'm just wondering if there is something, is there something something that's on that's causing some feedback before Julius starts? Or maybe Julius, you should just say hello and see if you come through okay without the feedback. Hi,
Hello.
Julius.
Hello.
Yeah, the hello seems okay, but I just think let's just get going then. But it's just that it's a number of people have reported the feedback, so I just want us to be clear.
Yes, and I think I keep getting the notices on the screen. I don't know if everyone is getting that for admittance.
Okay, well, I'm sorting it out. So, okay, right. Sorry about interrupting that flow there. So it's over to Julius.
Okay, thank you very much, Marge and William, for the very generous introduction. I think the question, which is where is our justice, is a very broad and sympathetic question, but that could be answered in a sentence. If I could, I would say that it is embedded in the political, social, and economic structures of the society. And I would develop my that answer to look at the definition of criminal justice in the very strict sense, but also in the substantive sense. In the strict sense, it is the determination of guilt or none of that, or innocence. And if guilt is found, then there's punishment, which is proportionate to the crime. Now, in the strict sense, we know of the police, we know of the court system, and we know of the prisons, and if possible, the probation. But in the wider sense, in the substantive sense, we would want to bring in equity. We want to bring in equality. We want to bring in fairness. We want to look at the political, socio-economic state of play in the society, which carries the bulk of it all. I'll look briefly at the situation, African diaspora, people from the African continent, before coming out, take an example of Cameroon, where I come from originally. Before colonization, we had very solid structures that dealt with peace, the provision of peace, the provision of justice, and they did resolve disputes when they arose in a way that was focused on reconciliation, mediation, and forgiveness. But then, when colonization came, all these institutions were demolished, and we then were presented with the court system, which focused on punishment, changed the laws that the African people had, the communities had, and they did not only demolish those strong institutions, they replaced them with strong men and women. Well, in the days, it was really mainly strong men to take over the control. And all this was because they would use the strong men to acquire the wealth of the African people. And you see why I say economic, I bring in the economic in, because when people are poor and deprived, the chances of getting into crime and criminality and being found within that remit is high. The strong men ensured that the changes, radical changes brought in so quickly by the colonial masters were not rebelled against. So any rebellion was clamped down significantly by the strong men, that replaced the strong institutions that we had. We started hearing of constitutions. We started hearing of parliamentary democracy and so on. But in reality, whether it's parliament, whether it's the constitution, they all gathered powers and gave into the hands of one man who was always promised protection and security by the colonial master and carried on really, couldn't say abusing the people. Now, people had to actually decide on what to do. Sometimes people have to find themselves moving on, moving away from the continent to anywhere in the world, the diaspora. UK, for example, we've had scenarios where people have come in, and wherever we go, there is always that concern. There's always that tag. They are coming. In the UK, we've had it recently where all the accusations have been labeled on the African diaspora or the Black person or the stranger, if I may use a more general word. These accusations that we are taking the jobs, immigrants are taking our jobs, immigrants are taking our houses, and so on and so forth. And in reaction to that, the government has taken some very, very draconian measures to prevent this from happening. And I would just say that between 2014 and now, 2 immigration acts have been passed targeting migrants, and which are draconian. If you were to drive a car without leave to be in the United Kingdom, you could go to prison. You can't have a bank account. You cannot work. If you work, the proceeds from your work could be confiscated. You can't rent a house. If a landlord lets you in a house, the landlord could go to prison. And so if you as an African diasporan, you were to go and look for a property, you will find that the landlords are generally very skeptical. So when you find yourself in such a deprived, in such a desperate situation, the chances of getting a visit from the police and therefore the court system and therefore prison is not far. Now, we have seen that our original way of dealing with disputes, namely resolving them by way of mediation, reconciliation, works, as opposed to the court system that was introduced and brought in, and came down and pronounced judgments, sending people to prison without necessary training and support for the people to get used to all these new things that were lumbered on them. Not too long ago, a good example I would want to use is the situation in Rwanda. The Gakaka courts, which were introduced by Paul Kagame, the president. And he said the court will use the traditional system to resolve disputes. Kakaga means just grass, openness. These people sit out and resolve the disputes. And the way of resolving dispute includes apologies, reconciliation, and so on. And obviously, that is what has worked. Should we go back to that? Should we not go back to that? I would say that some of the draconian laws that were brought into Africa and left in the hands of these strong men that replaced the strong institutions that we had, some of them are still there. As recently as 2016, some 5 journalists were arrested and locked up because they said certain government officials were useless. And what is intriguing is that that law is a law from 1872, which was adopted in 1931, about then. But in 2016, the draconian law could still permit the government of Rwanda government of Zambia to arrest people because they use the word, they describe some government officials as useless. So the problem is really, really deep. And to find our justice, we have to carry on education and learning, that we have to start thinking about how we used to do things in the past and whether it worked. I'll end by saying, when these institutions in Africa, when they were degraded and demolished and destroyed eventually, the ideas behind them were not mediation, arbitration, reconciliation that we see booming in the West today, were all ideas that ran in those institutions before the colonial period. But that was transposed over here anyway. And now we have over 90% of the big disputes in Africa being resolved in London, in Paris, and in America. And we say Africa is poor. And because poverty calls it all, puts us into all sort of desperate situation, criminal justice and our justice will not come easy unless all these other institutions are clearly sorted. Thank you so much. I might have gone over my time, but I'm sorry about that if I did.
No, thank you, Julius. That's very powerful, and thank you for highlighting really for us the colonial legacies that are still so much apparent in the systems, and we'll certainly pick that up in the discussion. So now we turn to Dr. Charlene Sinclair, and I hope too that the sound issues have been resolved so everybody can hear clearly now. Please remember, if you have questions for the speakers, please put them into the chat box.
Thank you very much. I'm just so pleased to be here with you all, and I look forward to our conversation after the presentations. On April 20th, I gathered with organizers and leaders from across the country in a virtual room. One thing held us all in common: we were all Black, and we gathered because we didn't want to receive the news alone. After a year of protests, the 2 grueling weeks of a court trial, and 2 days of deliberation, we would now know whether Derek Chauvin, the officer that killed George Floyd, would be accountable for his murder. Most of us hadn't watched the streaming of the trial on incessant recaps projected by news stations throughout the day and into the evening. We couldn't, it was too painful. And now we waited. All of us had been on pins and needles all day, breaths caught in our throats as we waited. I can't breathe ringing in our ears, even as our own breaths grew shallow and anxious and foreboding. Many of us didn't believe that the jury would come back with a verdict of guilty, and we braced ourselves, waiting, shallow breath, taunt, praying we don't crack, break, or stop breathing. Guilty. Chauvin was taken away in handcuffs. But as my eyes followed the images on the screen of the television, I asked myself, why does it feel so hollow and so unsatisfying? Killing at the hands of police or proclaimed vigilantes proceeds seemingly unabated in the United States. Increasingly confronted by images of beaten and gunned down Black men and women, boys and girls, I've begun to consider whether it is even possible for Black people, for Black lives within the United States to matter. Does a moral code capable of staving off Black death exist, or is such a code merely a utopian fantasy? More importantly, are there strategies of resistance that appeal to this elusive illusion no more than reinscription of hegemonic dominance and power? In his essay, Necropolitics, Achille Mbembe writes, the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides to a large degree in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Hence, to kill or to allow to live constitutes the limits of sovereignty. So in addition, the right to kill may also tell us about underlying technologies of violence of the state. And even more importantly, the exercising of that right tells us about the state's relationship of the one put to death. It tells us about the relationship of Black people to the state in the US. And I would suggest that for us today, the question is really, what is the role of Black death in crafting our understanding of society? I start by looking back at Michael Brown, who arguably was the catalyst for the eruption of the Black movement for Black lives in the US and across the globe. So on August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown and his companion were walking down the middle of the street, and a Ferguson officer tells them to get on the sidewalk. They refuse, and then an altercation ensues. The witnesses and the police have different versions about what happened next, but they all agree that Brown runs away. So as I began to study this and starting to look at issues of power and subjectivity, I looked at the work of philosopher Louis Althusser and his notion of subjectivity, because this seemed to be an exemplary of his notion. So someone is running, the cop calls, "Hey, you," they turn around, and in his framework, the person that turns around now becomes both subject and subjected. So that person accepts their subjectivity to that power. Then there's an expansion of that by theorist Judith Butler, who says, well, they could turn around, but they have various ways of responding. They might actually just refuse and continue. But both of them refuse to understand the role of the state in its power around the decision to kill. They don't account for the fact that for Black bodies, the power of the state is more than simply a call, because at its commands are weapons of violence and death, weapons that in many instances compel the subject via the specter of violence and the memory of terror. So Brown responds to that violence, to the memory of violence, and not necessarily to simply the call towards subjectivity. So at that point, the state pursues Brown and kills him. His mother pleads with the officers to remove his body, but they ignore her pleas. And Michael Brown lies dead in the street for 4 hours before his body is finally removed, forcing residents to witness his body, the blood soaked body on the street for several hours. He becomes this specter, a reminder to all who live or all who remain alive that response and capitulation to subjection by the state does not necessarily guarantee you life. It is the state that determines who must live and who must die. So Michael Brown's life, quote unquote life, did not end with his death, but continued even after death, because a posthumous discourse after the execution sometimes is more important than the actual death itself, because that determines the subjectivity. That determines who gets to be called subject or not, at least within the context of the US and these police killings. So, who was Michael Brown? Was he a student? Was he a young man? Was he a robber? Was he dangerous? I remember on a panelist in the panel I was on asked, did we even,
Sorry, Charlene, you've gone muted.
oops, sorry, I don't know what I did. So I was saying that a panelist in a panel that I was on asked us if we had even considered that Michael Brown may have been a child, that he might have been afraid. But we don't. We never think of Black people as potentially vulnerable and afraid. And so, for Black organizers and activists and Black people writ large, Michael Brown's body did triple duty. It represented the ever present brutality of the police force against Black bodies, riddled with gunshots, lying prone and bloodied in the street. His corpse was a warning and an illustration to all that the power of the execution of state violence, even to the point of death, is there for any who dare not respond to the state. And importantly, his body became the galvanizing force for those desperate to believe that death need not be an all day present reality for Black people. His death became the galvanizing force of Black Lives Matter. And it became this discourse battle to craft the personhood, the humanity of both Michael Brown and Black people writ large. So, through the protests of his killing, the rallying cry of Black Lives Matter now was used to craft a human Black subject, a humanity that was denied during his life. So, for those claiming Black Lives Matter, the body made dead by the police became the body battleground. By their refusal to allow the dead to be unheard, their demand to let the dead speak, The movement for Black lives ensured that the Black body, now dead at the hands of the state, would not be quiescently mourned, but rather would become a loud and disruptive challenge to the reification and consolidation of white supremacist power. Subject in death that challenges, disrupts, and haunts. One that not only allowed the power of the state to have the final word, that does not allow the power of state to have the final word, but to become what Avery Gordon calls a ghostly haunting, a haunting that rears up time and time again because, in other words, the past is never static, it's never really done, it's baked into our society and into our social practices, and it follows us, it shapes us. And when the brutality of that past is not addressed, it rears up to haunt us. So the cry, Black Lives Matter, after each Black death by the hands of the state is a haunting. And in 2020, ghostly hauntings were experienced after a series of killings by police and vigilantes. The horrific shooting of Breonna Taylor, whose body was riddled with bullets as she laid in her bed, the chase and gunning down of Ahmaud Arbery in a Georgia neighborhood, the police shooting of Rashad Brooks in the parking lot of a Wendy's restaurant, and on and on and on. However, it was the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, that was the catalytic force for a ghostly reckoning through multiracial, intergenerational, global Black Lives Matter uprisings. But what made George Floyd's death different? The horrific nature of Floyd's death was caught on camera, but others had been also. I argue that it was the officer, Derek Chauvin, that was the difference. All watched the footage of a complacent George Floyd doing what he was told to do. There were no blurry images focused on the running body. No narrative could erase the power of the officer staring into the camera, hand in his pocket, nonchalant, indifferent to the life ebbing out of George Floyd's body. Floyd's cry for his mother, a gut wrenching cry that was wrenching and ignored. The power of the state that is often concealed was now starkly embodied and revealed as indifferent, as an indifferent producer of Black death. But once revealed, how can that power be neutralized such that the force of actualization of a self determinate life can be made possible for Black people? For those that are trained in mainline social justice movement building, the response requires that power, once revealed, is personified as the ultimate evil and the body made good. So, understanding that Black bodies in the US have difficulty appealing to a moral or ethical code, we often turn to justice by actually seeking a recognition within the very structure of justice that mean us to be dead. And so, if we're not careful, the strategies that are framed as claims that of claims of justice, claims that give us voice and agency, are actually calls for recognition while they are framed within a powerful claiming of Black humanity. So, a call for justice to find its expression in a verdict of guilty may, in fact, affirm and reinscribe not the humanity of Black people, but rather white supremacy and its handmaiden state power as the ultimate arbiter of who is human, who lives, and who dies. So, we must consider how we may actually make the claim without further solidifying these hegemonic roles of punishment. We must figure out how we make these claims without reinscribing law as the giver of justice. And so that is the question that remains open and that I would like to be in discussion. How might that happen? How can Black Lives Matter on their own terms, with all of their complexity, without appealing to law and order as the final arbiter? So yesterday, Chauvin was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison, but it continues to feel hollow and unsatisfying. Because in the US, the belief that the rules of society, the rules of law are ultimately designed to enable our lives together. But again, whose life really matters? While we waited for the verdict in April, a little girl was killed, and her name was Makai Bryant. She was 16 years old, but they said she looked old for her age. White supremacist state power narrated her as dangerous. After all, she had a knife, and therefore she was deserving of death. State power won because her death was mourned by few. Her image is not plastered across walls and on t-shirts. Her death was not a call to action. But if we are to believe that we are being haunted by those that have been killed, then she speaks and waits. She was not killed and dead, but she is now in ghost, waiting and demanding for us to give her voice and for us to not allow for the state to determine who she truly was. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation together.
Thank you, Charlene. That's very powerful and really will make us consider that within existing state structures, can we actually find justice? Or as you say, are we just reinscribing systems that are detrimental to us? You know, are we actually, by virtue of our race, enemies of the state? Some deep questions that I hope we will get to delve into later. So now we're going to move to our third and fourth speakers. So our third speaker is Dr. Tara Young, who's a criminologist and applied social researcher and lecturer in criminal justice and criminology at the University of Kent. Her research interests include collective offending, gangs, and gendered violence. And her body of work critically examines the manifestation of the gang as a social problem in England and Wales within the context of increasingly punitive political and criminal justice responses to antisocial behaviour and youth violence. She'll be followed by Dr. Corinne Bailey, who's sociologist and senior research fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies. He works in the field of social policy, again with a special interest in Caribbean youth, and in particular, youth and youth crime. Dr. Bailey has published extensively in this area and has conducted research for governments and international organizations. So I have quite a dynamic pairing with that kind of focus on young people and the criminal justice. So I hand over to Dr. Young.
Thank you, William and colleagues, for the invitation to speak at this event. I can see that I'm billed to speak about criminal justice in the UK, and that's just not possible to do in 10 minutes. What I can speak to, though, is a couple of criminal justice issues that have I've been researching for the last 3 or so years that I believe is a cause for concern for young Black and brown people in the UK. The first is the application of the principles of secondary liability, or joint enterprise as it's more commonly known, in serious cases of violent crime. And the second is the use of music videos and lyrics, particularly drill, rap, and urban music videos and lyrics as evidence in criminal trials involving young Black and brown people. So what is joint enterprise? I think it's important that we get a handle on this concept because as I go on, you'll see that it's really rather complicated. But the legal doctrine of joint enterprise has been the subject of much popular political and judicial debate in recent years. Joint enterprise is a term given to a complex set of legal principles that have developed in UK case law. The Accessories and Abettors Act in 1861, Section 8, stated this: whosoever shall aid, abet, counsel, or procure the commission of any indictable offence shall be liable to be tried, indicted, and punished as a principal offender. In other words, the principal, the secondary party to a crime, can be held responsible for the criminal behaviour of another person. So joint enterprise enables one individual to be held criminally liable and prosecuted for the criminal activities of another person if it can be proven that they intended to assist or encourage the principal party in the substantive offence. So I can hear someone. I'm going to continue on anyway. If they did not wield the fatal blow. So at this point, I think I need to give you some examples, and as it might be useful here. So picture a few scenarios. The first is two individuals intend to kill someone. They both use knives to fatally injure the victim, who dies as a consequences. In this circumstance, both defendants both assailants, are considered joint principals in the offence. They both took part in the criminal act, satisfying the actus reus requirement, and they also possess the mental element for the offence. So this is the least contentious scenario that falls under the umbrella of joint enterprise. Scenario 2 is where two individuals, let's call them D1 and D2, engage in a fight with another person, the victim. And then D1 produces a knife and stabs the victim with the other person's verbal encouragement. Here, D2 is liable for the murder if it can be shown that he or she encouraged D1 to act out the crime. The third scenario is more controversial, and this was known up until 2016 as parasitic accessorial liability. So in this scenario, you have two people who decide to commit a burglary, let's say a home invasion, and in the commission of the burglary, one of them kills the householder. Even though the other person, D2, did not attend for the friend to kill the homeowner, they can be held criminally liable if it can be seen that she or he should have foreseen the possibility that D1 might act as they did. In other words, that they might commit the act of murder, or at least perpetrate a crime with serious intent to harm someone. Now, these are the three scenarios that make up joint enterprise. But what if in the commission of a crime, it can't be determined who is the principal or who is the second party? Well, under joint enterprise principles, where it isn't possible to prove whether a particular defendant is a principal or an accessory, it's just sufficient to prove that the particular defendant participated in the crime as one or the other, as the principal or the secondary party. So the use of joint enterprise to convict secondary party to murder has been under much criticism in the UK, even though it's been around since the 1800s. And a debate on this has emerged in legal theory, parliamentary investigations, grassroots activism, and in other forms, academic forms. There have been a small number of empirical studies dedicated to understanding a joint enterprise. So arguably, this criticism of joint enterprise, the doctrine of joint enterprise, contributed to the review of joint enterprise in 2016, when the Supreme Court of the UK and the Privy Council ruled that the law on joint enterprise had taken a wrong turn in the early 80s, when foresight was a mental element used to affirm intention to assist or encourage the principal party in the act of murder. Now, the Supreme Court abolished parasitic accessorial liability, and what that did is it got rid of foresight as evidence of intention to engage in a criminal offence. But joint enterprise is still with us. And even though foresight cannot be taken as intention to commit a crime, it still can be used as part of the intention. So why does all this matter? Well, it matters because the existing empirical research shows us that prosecutors in the UK use joint enterprise year on year to convict thousands of young people, or thousands of people, should I say, for murder. A report by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism done in 2014 found that joint enterprise was used in 44% of all homicide cases between the period of 2005 and 2013. And that the Crown Prosecution Service has shown that joint enterprise was used to prosecute somewhere between 1,800 and 4,500 people for homicide between 2005 and 2014. Now, what the research also shows is that joint enterprise is disproportionately applied in cases of serious violence involving multiple numbers of Black and mixed-raced young men. And also disproportionately used in cases where defendants and or suspects have been identified as suspected gang members, promoting some people to describe it as a de facto anti-gang statute. What the empirical research shows us is that the overrepresentation of Black and mixed race young men as prisoners in cases of joint enterprise. And we can see that young Black and brown men who have been convicted of murder as secondary parties perceive the law to be unfair, both in terms of their conviction for murder and their punishment, which is quite often a life sentence. So if you go back to my scenario about scenario 3, where in the commission of the crime of burglary, the principal commits an additional crime of murder, the secondary party can be liable for this to be convicted of murder, but it's also likely that they are going to get the same sentence as the principal party. So the secondary party will get the same sentence as the principal party. So if you commit a knife murder in the UK, the starting minimum tariff is 25 years. So the secondary party in that example would get a minimum of 25 years, even though they did not wield the fatal blow. So joint enterprise is quite often used in cases of where there are multiple assailants, where it's very, very difficult to determine who actually committed the crime. So you might say to me, well, what does this have to do with music? Well, joint enterprise has been simultaneously fused in cases of serious group-related violence, such as the murder of Abdul Haifa. Now, Abdul Haifa was reported to be a member of the Rusham Crips, which is a street gang, supposed street gang operating in Moss Side, Manchester. And he was run down fatally and attacked by rival gang members after he strayed drunk, I believe, into their territory. Now, 13 young men, all Black, between the ages of 14 and 20 were arrested and charged and put on trial for his murder using the doctrine of joint enterprise. 11 were subsequently found guilty of the attack and convicted of his murder or manslaughter, even though some of them did not participate in the fatal attack that killed Abdul Haifa. At the trial, photographs showing young men throwing gang hand signs and or indicating self-admitted membership of a gang called Active Only. These pictures were taken from the defendant's social media accounts and put before the jury to consider as part of their deliberations, even though some of the material shown was of questionable merit and arguably not probative to the case, but rather prejudicial, and that the material shown did not prove intention to commit the serious crime, serious intention to harm or even kill. Nonetheless, this material was successfully converted into evidence and used by the prosecution to prove gang membership, infer connections between the principal and secondary parties, and probable motivation to commit or assist and encourage the crime. So to finish, I think just picking up on what Charlene was saying, we see here the absolute power of the state to inflict serious punishment on secondary parties that whose actions can be tangential to the act of serious violence and or murder. The length of sentences that the secondary parties are receiving are enormous if you consider the starting tariff of serious violent crime with a knife to be 25%, and if a gun is wielded, the minimum tariff is 30 years. I think that Charlene talked about death. I believe that joint enterprise could be, a conviction of joint enterprise could be conceptualized as a slow death for the secondary parties who are often on the periphery of a serious violent crime. I'm not delimiting the seriousness of the violence that occurs to the victim. That is not my issue here. My issue here is the justification for the secondary party who may well be innocent of the offence of murder to receive sentences comparable to the principal offender if found guilty. I think this begs the question of how joint enterprise can be justified when there is evidence to suggest that it contravenes two basic principles of criminal justice, that is fair labelling and proportionate punishment. Just to end, joint enterprise can be considered an invisible death, where young people, some as young as 15, are ghosted in our prison systems. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to a conversation.
Great. Thank you, Tara. Yeah, very insightful. Like you say, what that is doing to whole generations of young people that get caught up in that is, as I think has been alluded to in the chat, very terrible. Hopefully we can again pick up on that afterwards. So our last speaker, not our least, but grateful to have him here today, is Dr. Corinne Bailey. So over to you, Corinne.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me just share my screen because I just have a very few slides to show. We good? You see my screen? I hope so.
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right, cool. Okay. So Caribbean countries, we actually tend to use incarceration to a greater degree than other regions in the world, unfortunately. 6 of the 15 countries in the world with the highest incarceration rates worldwide are Caribbean countries. That's an unfortunate statistic, as you can imagine. I gave a lot of thought to what would be the best way to spend my 10 minutes here that would give you a good idea of the way in which my work interrogates justice. So I want to take the discussion in a slightly different direction. I want to talk not necessarily about the colonial legacy as it impacts on the justice system per se, but on how the colonial legacy has impacted on the system of education in the Caribbean, and has served to, in many cases, constrain the choices of poor inner city residents, and so widen that economic gap between rich and poor. it feeds into a large argument related to how, you know, this creates an environment that leaves the poor with little option but to seek illegitimate means of survival, of course. But given the time constraints, I'm just going to focus on the education system. This is the type of work that I do as it relates to crime, trying to interrogate why certain sectors of the population come into contact with the justice system. What you're seeing on the screen right now is the level of education across various countries in the Caribbean for prisoners at the time of arrest. At the moment, these are current figures. As you can see, education is a major factor, with the majority having not completed secondary school. I'm going to use Jamaica as an example to illustrate what it is, the point that I'm making. That schools reproduce inequalities in society. That's been a persistent theme of research on the education system in the Caribbean, probably beginning in the immediate pre-emancipation period. The problem of the Jamaican education system stems from the fact that its character was really determined by the country's elites. It was determined by the middle and upper strata that really saw the education of the lower strata in very functional terms, geared to very practical ends and determined really by the economic needs of the country. And that's an attitude that can be traced directly to the pre-emancipation period, when planters were very antagonistic to the efforts of missionaries to educate slaves and freed Blacks, since of course they were concerned about the destabilizing effect that education would have on the existing social order. But as emancipation became obvious, as its arrival became obvious, planters realized that of course some kind of socializing would be necessary if they were to continue to have a compliant workforce. The right type of education, they felt, would domesticate the Black population, so that once they're free, they would have acquired the values that would support the existing social and economic order. And so intent was the British government on crafting an elementary education as an instrument to do just that, you know, to inculcate the values that would make for the acceptance of that social order in society. That all major elements of the schooling process, admin, administration, syllabus, teaching methods, pupil education, they were all geared towards that. This was a system of education that an independent Jamaica was built on. And it's been described as a dual system of posh and poor, one for the posh, one for the poor. Now, despite many of the changes that have occurred over the years in the education system, essentially that posh and poor system unfortunately remains intact. The children of the poor in large part attend infant or basic schools, much of which are unrecognized and offer unacceptable levels of care. Only a small percentage really have access to the more stimulating educational environment of the kindergartens and the independent proprietary schools that are on the posh side of this dual system. Similarly, of course, at the primary level, the fee structure of those proprietary schools excludes the children of the poor. As I said, you know, they are educated in the publicly financed primary system, or what has been referred to as a system for the poor. Now, entry into the traditional high schools, and it must be noted that these are the ones that are most closely associated with future success, and most of which were set up during the colonial period, ideally not for Blacks, is based on selective examination. So top schools are given the opportunity to cream off top performers, most of whom obviously will come from the private proprietary system because they are better prepared. While children of the poor who have now been labeled as failures by the examinations, they're generally funneled into the poorly staffed, poorly equipped former comprehensive schools, which were really just introduced as part of the government's plan to expand secondary education to poor areas. You know, not as any radical experiment with mixing as you know, comprehensive schools traditionally should be or were, or to improve the performance of low and middling achievers. It was simply to provide schools for the poor. The majority of the patrons of these schools, which really can be termed in large part dead-end schools, remain trapped in a cycle of intergenerational poverty. Now, what you're seeing here is a map of the social areas of the city, and this is Kingston. All I need you really to recognize is that the downtown zone, zone of transition, uptown low-income zone, those are the zones of Kingston that are occupied by the poor. While that zone to the north in white is the middle and high income zone, which is in which middle and high income people reside. And as you can see, this is a location of the former comprehensive schools that I was discussing in relation to the social areas of the city. As you can see, those schools were placed at the heart of the inner city. It's obvious that these schools were seen as just a solution to inner city, to the problems of inner city primary schools. There are barely any in the middle and high income areas. There are annual rankings of high schools in Jamaica, and one of the schools, I'm going to give that school, so I don't get into any problems, I'm going to give that school the pseudonym Uptown High. It's perennially ranked as one of the top performing schools in the island. The other that I'm going to call Downtown High is one of those former comprehensive schools. It was upgraded, quote unquote, upgraded from junior high to new secondary to comprehensive, and finally it was labeled as a high school. But I want you to note that in the year under study, the lowest grade for a student accepted into Uptown High was higher than the highest grade of any student accepted into Downtown High. In essence, nothing has changed despite it being now labeled, these type of schools now being labeled as high schools. Of the 184 students that gained admission into Uptown High, 127 came from that posh system, the proprietary schools. So I've mapped their home addresses here. Obvious to see, the downtown zone is practically empty. And the home addresses of those that that have been admitted into Uptown High, primarily from the Uptown High, middle and high income areas. Now, figure 3 shows the home addresses of students that gained admission into Downtown High. 72% of those gave addresses in the inner city, 3% that year from uptown low-income areas. The students that gained entry into Downtown High were drawn predominantly from poor inner city communities. Only 1% came from middle and high income areas. And as you can imagine, that would mean they did really, really badly in their exams. This is a waste of human potential, because I must make the point that very forcefully that those who are creamed off for the high prestige schools, they're not necessarily those of highest intelligence. Children living in this narrow, geographical area, they're not specially endowed, but the system does not start from a base of equity. It segregates levels of attainment, and this is simply based on privilege. My own work among young men living in poor inner city communities, it reveals a bitterness because of their experiences in these dead-end schools with no preparation for further study or the world of work. They feel that they're stigmatized and they're locked out, or they know that they're stigmatized and they're locked out of the labor market because of their lack of qualifications. This system of education spawned from a colonial conceptualization of what education should look like for Black residents. But it's put the poor on a collision course with the justice system. Jamaican prisons are filled with those who have suffered at the hands of this dual system. I don't have to tell you that the vast majority of those that come into contact with the justice system in Jamaica have been part of that poor side of the system. But if it is accepted that this is a system of privilege and structured inequality that excludes young men and women of intelligence, then of course it should be no surprise that that some of them turn this intelligence into the construction of alternative careers. They don't always do this because the benefits to be gained are so great that that traditional employment ceases to be an attractive alternative. But because, as one of the young men told me, they simply don't have a lot of choice. So thank you very much. That's it from me.
Great, thank you, Corinne, for giving us that perspective, really, and showing us the importance of issues of class when we want to think about these systems and how they operate. Now I'm going to hand over to Marge briefly, who's going to introduce a live performance. And whilst the live performance is going on, please think of questions that you want to ask to our speakers and put those in the chat, and we'll have a question session after the live performance.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. Well, again, for those of you who are regular, we have had on a couple of occasions Nairobi Thompson, fantastic poet, and we are privileged to have Nairobi with us this evening, and she's going to do a piece for us. So I know you've come in on the Alosi iPad, Nairobi. Welcome.
I've had some IT difficulties today.
No, and we are so grateful that you've stayed the course. So thank you. We cannot wait. Over to you and welcome.
Thank you so much. This is a short piece, and it was really written the week that George Floyd was murdered. So it's very much my immediate reactions to that incident. And it's called Cry Murder. The knee on the neck, whole body bone bearing down on soft tissue. The blood choke, lynching without rope, legal strangulation, compressing carotid arteries, compressing the airway in plain, unabashed view. A bold dare in the eyes for anyone to intervene and meet same fate. Authorized restraint techniques for the man who is not resisting. Brute force, causing ischemia, his heart labors, hypoxia in the brain, his limpness ignored with psychopathic calm. Paid to protect, paid to serve, officials stand by and let this man die. Watch the soul leave his eyes. A sacking will not quell this tempest. A litany of apologies will not lull incredulity to sleep. Cry havoc, cry murder. All patience is choked from us, and civility is the gateway to lies and platitudes. Blood for blood, brethren, until sulfur stains the air and all are anguished. Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Thank you as ever. Thank you, brilliant Nairobi.
Thank you, Nairobi. Yes, so powerful. So I'm gonna bring back the speakers, and we'll engage in a brief discussion amongst ourselves, picking up some of the themes. And like I say, please put your questions in the chat so that we can also ask and get those answered. So had a very powerful presentations from Julius, Charlene, Tara, and Corinne. So let me kick off with a question to Julius and Charlene, because since you both spoke about state power and its power to dehumanize Black lives, lives of people of African descent. And then Julius kind of offered a potential solution around mediation, arbitration. So I wonder whether Julius, Charlene could speak into that. What might the alternatives be? I know in the US we've had themes around defund the police, but how can we make these systems more humane, or do we have to abandon them and have new systems that humanize our experience within criminal justice systems? So give that one to Julius and to Charlene.
I'm looking at Julius. Are you beginning, Julius, or? Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Go ahead.
Sorry, am I beginning? So I didn't quite.
I didn't know. I'll jump in. Okay. And then you can go. How about that?
Fine.
So I believe that to a large extent, we have to abandon those systems. And I say that um, in a way that just follows up on what Dr. Bailey just said. And I say abandon the systems because we use an inordinate amount of time trying to make work systems that are deeply designed for us to be killed, whether it's slow death or quick death. So we spend a constant, inordinate amount of time battling those systems. And while we're doing that, then the actual systems that give us life continue to atrophy and be dismantled. So even as we are talking about defunding the police in the US, and that is becoming federal legislation, if the legislation passes, the sticking point is whether or not police will have immunity, right? If they can kill with impunity. And that is extremely important, and we must take that on. But as we are taking that on, we have huge swaths of legislation that will bring resources into communities that can potentially enable us to refund schools, that will potentially enable us to do job training and green jobs. We have legislation that is completely cutting off our access to the vote, really moving the US towards a more authoritarian regime. And so the way I would say it is that we need to be clear about what structures are almost like the dangling, the dangling rabbit that we go after that just takes up all of our energy. And then in the meantime, we have so much that we need to be fighting for. In the work that I do on theologically, I actually look at Dr. Cone, the late James Cone's Black theology, because it centers itself on Fanon's notion of the Black being, the Black ontology. How do we begin to imagine what is Blackness divorced of whiteness, Blackness that is not created by whiteness? And if we can do that, then what do we need for our material thriving? And how do we develop plans and structures along those lines, and not simply through the reaction to what whiteness puts upon us? So that's how I would begin.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Julius.
Yes, sorry. Thank you so much, William. I think the first thing I would say is that the systems really need to be looked at again. Like I said earlier on, when something is working and working well, don't unnecessarily fix it unless you have an intention to do something else. I give example of the laws that came into, for example, Africa, because it all boils down to education, the economy, and wealth. And one group needs to show the other that they are superior in order to maintain the status quo. And until that balance is hard, we will still be going around in circles. I said that the way we were resolving disputes in pre-colonial times was with a view to have reconciliation, was with a view to rehabilitate. was with a view to come back together as one people. It was not just sending people to prison and then that's it. And because it is this circle, it goes around. When the common law came to Africa, Cameroon, for example, I'll just plop off one, section 27 of the Southern Cameroon High Court law. It says that customary laws, those laws that used to be in place before the colonial masters came, they say it could be used provided they are not repugnant to natural justice, equity, and good conscience. But who determines what is equity? Who determines what is good conscience? But the same common law tells us that it is okay for a man to go away with another man's wife. There's no problem with that. But if you ride your bicycle on the pavement, it is a crime. So it actually turned our way of reasoning completely, because pre-colonial time, we knew that it was a wrong thing. It was a bad thing to go away with somebody's wife, those sort of things. They were just like taboo. Don't even think about it. But all these new laws that came with colonization, with one view, to take this wealth as much as possible. It ties up with education. If we are poor, if people are economically backward, socially backward, then the chances of being involved, caught up in the criminal justice system is higher. The way the institutions, as I mentioned again, which were degraded and demolished in most cases, the ideas weren't. So mediation today, that works here in a commercial context. Arbitration works here in a commercial context. That's part of generating that wealth. But what about the young people who get into trouble, and then when they come out from prison, they don't even know who the other side is. They haven't got no idea. Whilst in prison, their family members might be attacked by the other side. So there's no sense of reconciliation. I mean, I'll give the last example, the one that I mentioned earlier, the Gakaka court in Rwanda. It's called Gakaka, the grass. Everybody sits on the grass. It gave the opportunity, and while dispute was being resolved, it gave opportunity for confession. It gave the opportunity for people to really come out and let the perpetrators come out and say exactly what their motivation was. And the victims will understand. And in most cases, they ended up hugging each other. And that is how you can eradicate this sort of thing, this whole thing that things are done in a way that you generally you're not even sure what the consequences of your next act would be. Once it is done in the open court, in the open field, everybody sees what is going on. Even a child growing up knows already what is right and what is wrong, what the community and the society expects of them, what they don't, and they will grow up in the rightful way. But failing that, I mean, recently, it's discussion going on today in England about a research that shows that working class white kids are failing because of the phraseology white privilege. Come on, when things like those really make me think, but hang on, where is the relationship? And when that kind of survey, those kind of reports begin to come out, what will follow will be a draconian law that will hit these young Black people again who are beginning to achieve to get to a certain standard. I'll leave it there as of now.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you both. Yes, very interesting ideas really around what we need to do for our own material framing, as you said, Dr. Sinclair. And then can we go back to our pre-colonial past in order to envisage what our future might look like? So some interesting points. So we come to Dr. Young and Dr. Bailey. I think there seemed to be a synergy in your presentations around the idea of both class, geography, and labeling, in a way of that those labels are really a detriment to African descendants, both in the UK and in the Caribbean. But is education solely by itself, the opportunity to go to better schools, have better opportunities, is that in a sense the great solution? Is that the magic wand that will bring young people out of these circumstances, or are there other things at play? So maybe Dr. Young and then Dr. Bailey can go.
Okay, so William, I'll start with your last point. Is education the great solution? Well, I think that probably education is the great solution for the criminal justice system as far as it can be educated. And what I mean by that is that you're quite right in terms of young black, predominantly young black and brown men are labelled as when they offend in groups are quite often labelled as gang members. And that label comes with all sorts of connotations about intent, about complicity, about the ways in which young men perform violence against other young men. And what makes that label so compelling is that it has or resonates with the criminal justice system. So what you get is police officers who frame, or should I say misframe, the behaviours of young black and brown men, the friendships of young black and brown men, the ways in which young black and brown men move through space and place. So the research that I've done over the last 3.5 years that included interviews with police detectives working homicide cases and prosecution and defence lawyers, what we found from the police is that there was in a number of cases an inability to view groups of young men as anything other than gangs. And the offending that they're doing is anything other than gang related. So when investigating a serious violent offence, whether it be manslaughter, murder, or GBH in some way, then that offence then becomes framed as gang related violence and gang related activity. And then that enables the prosecution counsel to use particular material like social media accounts, social music, lyrics and videos as evidence in those cases because they're already seen through a particular lens. So for me, I think what we need to see that is problematic actually, because the police and prosecution practitioners gather this evidence for criminal prosecution and they make effective use of this material, converting what could be benign material into evidence in court, right? And then the police officers are brought on as expert witnesses in particular trials, when then with very little expertise in understanding gang culture, in understanding friendships and relationships between black and brown men and women, have very little expertise on rap lyrics, on aestheticism, on clothing, on art, black art and the like. And this material gets reconstructed as truths. So going forward, I think that there needs to be, as far as it can happen, is a re-education within the criminal justice system to understand the more nuanced aspects of music, of drill, of group-related offending, and not have offences of that nature always reduced to the lowest common denominator, which is a gang. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, no, that's great. Dr. Bailey, from your context.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if there is a if there's a magic wand as you know, it's the education is still the has still been shown within the Caribbean to be the #1 avenue towards upward social mobility, and so it's fairly obvious that improving levels of education will expand opportunities for poor inner city residents. So, but it's I would prefer to say that we need to ensure avenues towards the social inclusion of all, and that education is a extremely useful means of doing that. It's one of the important ways of doing that, but it's one of many. So, if I speak specifically on education, of course, it needs to be offered. It needs to, everyone has to have an equal opportunity to obtain it, but it's not just that they need an equal opportunity to obtain an education, because then what was done in the past by throwing these comprehensive schools in the downtown catchment areas would be okay. What's more important is the quality and type of education that they get, just even if we were to say, let's improve the quality and the teaching within these schools, you still don't have the social mixing that we know is very important as it relates to an overall quality of education and experience for young people. So in effect, what I'm saying is that although our colonial masters have long since left, we have remained as gatekeepers of a racist system, and maintaining that system as is will do what it was designed to do, and so it literally has to be dismantled, and our ideas and our constructs of what education should be and should look like need to form the basis of a new and improved system.
Thank you. Yeah, it certainly seems to be that what people are saying, almost a need of a reformed education systems, isn't it? Education systems that empower those that are seen as marginalized, but also education systems that educate those, re-educate those that are in power and influence, so that they certainly provide a better, inclusive, and a genuine education system that uplifts everybody. So I think now we've got questions that are from the chat. I think Marge is going to put those to you. Are you on mute, Marge?
Yep, sorry. I think this next one is really for Tara, because it came on very early after her presentation, and it says, it starts by, just a statement, a comparison. Why wasn't joint enterprise applied in the murder of Blair Peach? The investigation identified the police serial who was responsible for his killing, but were unable to identify the individual responsible for the fatal blow. Had that been a group of Asian or Black men, no doubt joint enterprise would have been applied. So really the question is, I guess it's, now Blair Peach was a 1979, 78, 79 when he was killed in Southall. And the question is, why wasn't joint enterprise applied for him, for the people who were around at the time, who took part in his killing? Any thoughts on that, Tara?
So like I said, yeah, that's a good question. And what I can say is I'm not a lawyer, right? That's the first thing. That's the first thing I say, I'm not a lawyer. So speaking to that particular case, I would be speaking outside of my expertise. But what I will say about joint enterprise is it isn't routinely applied in all cases of collective violence. That it's applied in specific incidences, and it seems to be more often than not applied in cases that involve Black and brown young men who are offending as part of gangs and in some form of street-based violent altercation. So if we take that setting, then the police officers in this incident, they would be, and I say this, performing their duty. I know that seems, I know that duty was absolutely ended in a fatality, but the fact that joint enterprise is not used in cases where we think that it could be applied shows us that it isn't applied as a doctrine across all cases of group-related violence. In many ways, we could say that there are a number of cases where joint enterprise could be applied. If we take George Floyd, could we say that the other officers, by being merely present, were assisting and encouraging that act of violence? Okay, but I think the takeaway point is that as a doctrine, it is used in some cases, more often in some cases rather than others. I hope that is a satisfactory answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in on that one. If not, I'll go to the next question. And this one is from Ade, and Ade says, in the light of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, what recommendations do the panel have as to how to reduce the school to prison pipelines, which disproportionately include youths of African descent? And then he goes on to give an example of ESD for 2030 and SDG. I think Agenda for Sustainable Development, have been advocated. Can they make a difference with positive impact to exclusion and poorer outcomes for our youth? But it's really saying, what recommendation can you offer to break that link, the prison, school to prison pipeline? And that's for anyone who wishes to come in there.
I will speak to the U.S. context. I know that my work in community organizing actually began in the 80s when there was a big push around community economic development, where affordable housing development and business development was a part of communal self-determination. And so many of the programs that assisted and underwrote the possibility of sustainable development within those communities were completely eradicated during the Reagan years. And so for us to begin to think about sustainable development, we have to actually, at least from the US context, begin to think about how do we undergird that, not only with community organizing, but with the resourcing to enable that to happen. There's an organization in Washington, D.C. that is actually working around the cradle to prison pipeline. And one of the things that they found in their struggle against the city, I believe it was the city, and was around the development of a project that was being technologically moved forward. But what their study showed was that it was actually greener and it employed people to do it in a much more sustainable way. So they weren't even saving money to move mechanically forward. But we have this idea that that the best way for us to be able to do something is somehow increasingly engage technology, and we put productivity, so-called productivity, as our highest purpose, and not the human development, of people at the center and determine that to be our highest purpose. And so if we were to do that, I think that that is the core of that sustainable development piece, is to determine what do people need, what does communities need, how do we make that happen, and how do we prioritize that. And it may mean, maybe it'll take an extra month, or maybe it will not, maybe it will save money, but maybe it will not, because in the long run it will save human lives, in that it will have resourceful, engaged people in community working towards our collective thriving. And I think that for me, that would be what I would say.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else in the panel wants to comment on that one, please?
Well, I could just say very briefly. Okay, very briefly, two quick things. I think the first thing is for us as parents to really make all efforts we can to see our children achieving in their education. I know it's difficult because us, most of the time as parents, we have to do 3, 4, 5 jobs because of how life is. It doesn't matter how qualified you are, the chances are you will, you'd have to struggle. So we have to try to be making all the sacrifices we can so that our children are on the straight and narrow, but also get involved within the school institutions. We could be school governors and do other things so that we are sure that what is happening in school is in line with what we think, because the education system here is in a way that everybody is promoted. Those who are achieving and are not achieving, they all go together until they leave primary school. In fact, something came up not long ago that children should not be marked down, or with their work should not be marked with red pen. And I remember the days of my primary school, you were given a big 0 and your eyes and ears were drawn to that 0 to show that, but now they encourage everyone to just go move along. So when the boys, young black boys, for example, they get to secondary school where it becomes harder, they can't cope because they have not actually captured the basics in primary school. And that is when truancies begin. They start feeling, they start trying to avoid school. And obviously, they don't have the same opportunities like their young white counterparts, who are more likely to have apprenticeships and all those sort of things than them. So the chances are, when they avoid going to school, or they leave homes that they're going to school and then they hang by roadside, then that is a sure route to trouble, and prison will not be far. So I think our engagement is key in the children's education and within the institutions. And also, if we can also really see, there are not a lot of them, black organizations and businesses out there who can give apprenticeship. It would be a good thing, encourage them to consider doing that, because when a young black boy is not going to school, the chances are, I did a case not long ago. This young guy, brilliant guy, he had 3 A levels, AAA, 3 A's, but he couldn't go to university that year because of his immigration status. No university will allow him to start. So he stayed at home for 1 year. And obviously, staying at home, he became a bit bored and he would hang around with local lads. The first time he was caught with local lads with amount of marijuana, not that sufficient, not that big, but I'm not saying it's a good thing. He was caught with it. He went to prison. The white officer who arrested them, there were white young people there as well. He told him that you're going to prison. That was his first offense. He was taken to, obviously charged. And so when I was actually at sentencing, I was actually I was in tears, because this young guy, that was the end of his everything. Those 3 A's that he had went like that. So he went to prison. So we just have to be there, get involved.
Thanks, Julius. Thank you. Corin, were you going to make a comment?
I was. It's a difficult question to answer because all of our countries are so different. and we're at different stages of development. So, you know, you can only speak really, really specifically. As far as Jamaica is concerned, the truth is that a decision has to be made. The government has to make a decision as to what the role of education is. You know, as I said, we are, you know, we're carrying, by maintaining the system, we're carrying out the absentee mandate of our colonial masters. But we have to determine what is it has to be based upon the view of what type of society you think is needed. If you simply upgrade teachers and facilities in low-income areas for those schools, I mean, that's great, and it would produce you know, students with a good mix of abilities and ultimately better performance and participation in the workforce. And for those that believe that education ought not to be a tool in social engineering, that would suffice. But the truth is that separate is rarely translates to equal. And so, you know, if one of the goals is to reduce social segregation, we need more. And I don't think you can leave that to the whims of parents necessarily to choose, and certainly not for schools to be able to cream off top performers, because then you're just recycling the problem. And so very specifically, as far as Jamaica is concerned, that system of creaming needs to be thrown away. Social exclusion is more than just a distribution of resources and mere participation in the education system or in working life. It has to include relations between people and the dignity that derives from people being included in a social network in its entirety.
It's unmute, Marge, sorry.
Sorry, a couple of quick questions because I'm mindful of time. And William, do pull me up with timing. This one is
in that case, one more.
One more?
Question, yeah, an audience, yeah. Please bear with us, and we'll try to end after this set by between 9:15 and 9:20.
Okay, let's. There's possibly two more, because I want a really quick answer, Julius, on this one, because someone said you were talking about the system. It felt like the system of arbitration, which was about the, you know, coming together as a people and how it was done in that particular way when we look back. And I think the question was really saying, is there a society on the African continent that's doing that now? So it's a quick answer. Yes or no, and if it is, where?
The answer is yes. I gave the example of Rwanda.
Okay, right. That's nice and sharp. Thank you. Thank you very much, Julius. Okay, question for the speakers. It is evidently needed that there's a change. Sorry, it is evidently needed change the system to be led by suitable professionals, or will it require street level revolution driven by angry masses? Given that we have been disciplined, educated to be respectable, law-abiding citizens. I'm reading into that it's really saying, you know, is it about having professionals who are going to really lead out in pressing the revolution to change the education system, or is it really about parents coming up in arms and really pushing things forward, you know, about saying that we need change? Where is this change going to, I'm reading into this question, where is this change coming from? Is it the system, or is it the parents? Again, you know, anybody to answer that very quickly, please. And then I think I see, is that your hands that's raised, Mervyn? Okay, so if we can have one quick answer to that one, and then we'll have another question, and then we will move on. Where should the changes, the leading of the changes, come from? Is it either or? Is it both?
Both. It is both. It is Antonio Gramsci talks about organic intellectualism. So it is the ability to be able to speak the desires and calls of the people with the understanding and the intellectual analysis that will allow us to understand how to break that open and create real change. So it is both. We are all needed in that battle.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlene. Okay, Mervyn in a minute, but just before we move on, I guess what Charlene's saying speaks to some of the points that came out in the chat, where one of the pointers said that something about almost going back to Saturday schools. We cannot just expect the system to actually educate our children, that we have got to be prepared to enter into that educational space as we have done in the past, and just to really continue to do that. Mervyn, very quickly.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the idea of education as the answer, and educating our children, we know, has very specific value, especially for many who came through the Saturday school system. But if any of you have looked at the responses to the sentence of Chauvin and what people have said, it really worries me. I'm going to share one response, which is typical of the many responses. And we know social media, gathers lots of people from all different walks of life who feel free to say whatever they want, many times anonymously. But this is what people are saying in response to the Chauvin get 22 years. For what? For trying to uphold the law? He didn't even kill the scum. The world knows he was drugged up and in possession of a firearm. He was no saint and died in hospital. So how can this poor man be done for murder? Somebody seriously needs to be thinking of freeing that poor man. His knee wasn't doing anything to that scum. He was still talking, wasn't he, for God's sake? The world saw him. It's not the officer's fault. The scum was drugged up. For what reason have they done this to the poor police officer? What's troubling to me is that that is typical of many of the responses to that sentencing. And when it comes to education, I was around at a time when we started to do Black studies for Black kids because we saw that they were having a problem. But we realized soon that you can't just do Black study, as useful that is for identity and understanding your background and your culture, unless you're changing the wider society as well. We're going to get more police officers and more teachers who are thinking just like these people who are responding to that sentencing. So whatever we need to do in terms of education, it has to be for everybody in society, because we're all part of the one world. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Okay, on that one, on this last comment, I'm going to go back to you, William, because of time, and just hand it back over in terms of taking it forward.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for those that have stayed on to the discussion. So that leaves me to thank all our speakers for really brilliant and nuanced presentations around kinds of complex issues. You've certainly given us food for thought and hopefully food for action. That's what Black Pack is about. We just want to think about these things, but actually it would be for action. So my profound gratitude and thanks to all our brilliant speakers for taking the time to engage with our discussion and debate this evening. So just want to tell people what's happening for our next Black Pack, and then we'll say goodbye. As for those people that we sometimes hang around for an after chat where people take the microphones off and make comments and chat, we're around, so you're free to do that. So I think I'm handing back to...
Okay, I think it's back to me. Okay, well, the next month, because remember we have an event at the end, the last Saturday every month, And our next event, thank you very much again to our speakers, it's been fantastic. Our next event is actually not a critical conversation, but a Black Pack interview. And the Black Pack interview will be with Professor Gus John. I think, Mervyn, you're going to share your screen. That'll give us a bit more information on that.
Yep.
And I'll just talk us through it. We meet on the 31st of July at 7:30. And this time round, it's going to be my pleasure to actually have an interview with Professor Gus John. Now, Gus John, international consultant, executive coach, visiting professor, academic, human rights activist. There are so many words I can use to describe the work that Professor John does. But it will be our pleasure, because since 1960, he's been active on the issue of education and schooling in Britain, something we've just been talking about. And in actual fact, he was the first Black Director of Education and Leisure Services in Britain. He is a renowned activist and an educator, and he's been working in the education system as well as speaking out. I see him as one of these people who speaks truth to power, and he does not mince it. He says it as it is. So it is with great pleasure we look forward to actually speaking to Professor John. And what's also quite interesting is that he's been on a lot of platform lately. We've seen him in the recent television program in the UK here about the education, the way in which the system turned many of our children, or rated many of our children, as educationally subnormal when they were not. And he spoke very eloquently there. But it would be lovely to speak with him to find out more about the person himself and some of his motivation. So join us on the 31st. Saturday the 31st at 7:30, so that we can be in conversation and having an interview with Professor John. So that's it really. It's now time for us to stop our recording to say, because we're now going to move away from this time where we've had our speakers and the event has been recorded. And really it's time to not only to say thank you to the speakers, but for those who wish to stay on, to just ask questions, to throw